So this video is part 3 of my review of the hidden true crime interview with Chris and Deb Sterns. So if you've missed part 1 and 2, I'll add the link for them below and feel free to go and check them out after this video. This is probably coming to you a little bit late because I've just spent the last 2 hours watching the hidden true crime interview with Becky Paddy, which is so worth watching if you have the time and if you have followed the Delphi case. I can highly recommend it. I know I will be going back and watching it again because there's just so much in it. Anyway, moving on. So I've covered this in 2 videos so far. This is part 3 of a 4-part series. This one could end up being slightly longer because I've noticed that the last 2 blocks of videos that I've recorded for this are slightly longer. So bear with me, given the last 2 were 2 hours, you're probably in for another 2-hour stint. I do just want to say thank you for people being so respectful in the last 2 videos. I know there are some people who disagree with my opinions of Chris and Deb Sterns, but for the most part, people have been extremely respectful in putting forward their own opinions when they disagree with mine, and I very much appreciate that. So with that said, let's just jump straight in.
You know, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it feels to some extent like your son was very childlike in a way. Like it's almost like with his interest in games as an adult and, you know, the solitary pursuits, it almost sounds like he really struggled to grow up.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Well, and I will also say he's a narcissist.
Okay.
It was all about Stefan. When Stefan wanted something, Stefan wanted it then. He didn't want to wait. He didn't want to wait for Christmas. He didn't want to wait for his birthday. It was now, and he would throw a fit.
That was such an interesting response from Deb. John was trying to throw her a line there, saying that he was a little bit childlike with his like of games and his solitary pursuits. But instead of grabbing onto it, she comes out with he was a narcissist and he basically had to have things when he wanted them, and he wasn't, you know, he had to have them then, like now. So she totally brushed over what he was saying. Now, I have to say I wasn't comfortable with this type of questioning, putting him as being almost childlike. The way making that question, to me, that's almost giving an excuse. It's almost saying, well, it's because he wasn't fully developed mentally. And it's implying that perhaps he had the developmental level of a child. And you know what? Yes, he had those interests in games and Tamagotchis and solitary pursuits and everything. But I think that's a very different thing from saying someone is childlike. I know adults who are into gaming, and I even know an adult who paints those, like the Warhammer things, but he does it for, I think it's like Dungeons and Dragons or something that he plays with his friends. He's not like so obsessed that he spends forever painting them, but he does spend time painting them. But he is a perfectly normal person who happens to have ADHD, and so he has some of those Peter Pan qualities that you tend to see in some people who do have ADHD. It's a different way of viewing the world. But to say it like to have childlike qualities implies that that's the level that his brain is at. No, the guy was calculating. So I actually think that Deb's response was quite appropriate. Not this response you would expect from a parent, but I think she hit the nail on the head. He was a calculating narcissist. And his interest in games, his interest in solitary pursuits, that has nothing to do with Maddie's case, if you ask me. Now, I'm certainly not criticising John and saying that he doesn't know how to do his job. This is a professional. This is what he does for a living. But I just worry about the misinterpretation of that question.
And that was hard. That was hard on us, but it was harder on him because we didn't get into it.
So comment down below. Let me know, do you think that what she's saying there is honest? That when he was demanding things that they didn't give into it? Because she's given stories that show that they were quite indulgent of him and that they did give in to his needs. We've heard Jen say the same thing. And we've heard from his friends. The friend whose mother had the place where the horse was, he spoke about how Deb was constantly buying him all these playing cards and new games and stuff like that. So it sounds to me like maybe they've listened to interviews on YouTube and they've realised that it doesn't look good for them to admit that they were extremely indulging of their son, and now they're claiming that they never gave into it. And there is an example, I'm not sure if it'll come up in this part of the interview or in what I cover tomorrow, but there's an example that shows that so clearly.
Even when he was younger, he would teenage years, he never grew out of that.
No. We kept waiting for. It seemed like there was a disconnect. You were like kind of this close, and all you needed to do is make this connection. And it was like,
John, he had no impulse control.
Yeah.
Really,
Okay.
if he wanted to do it, he did it, and then he paid the consequences later. He got put on restrictions. He had his car taken away. At one point, I went in and stripped his room of everything that he had because he had gone for 6 weeks without cleaning his room, and I had begged him for 6 weeks, please clean your room, or I'll come in and do it. No, I'll do it myself. Okay. Well, finally, I went in there and I took his wallet. I took his car keys. I went out and took the tags off of his car. And I told him, you're grounded. Period, until that gets done. And his friends were laughing their butts off at him, saying, you just got jacked by your mom. Said, get in there and clean your clothes, clean the closet and clean up your room. Which he finally did because of his friends, not because of me.
Yeah.
So it's like.
It was always, I'll do it, and never got done.
Yeah.
I really get the sense that Deb must have spent a lot of time criticising Stefan, putting him down, and essentially giving him the message that he was a failure. Because even here, Chris is talking about a disconnect in terms of him not really quite reaching the point of maturing and acting like an adult. And Deb goes straight back to talking about no impulse control. So back to negative tendencies. I don't think we've heard her say anything overly positive about him. And yet at the same time, she wants to blame Jen for all of this. It seems like in this interview, now someone pointed this out in my last video, it seems like this whole interview is a PR stunt to make Chris and Deb look good. Chris is doing it by trying to offer his explanations for everything. Deb is doing it by blaming other people, but also making Stefan look bad, blaming him, shaming him, which I guess in her eyes absolves them of any bad parenting. But I have to say, this story that she says about him not tidying his room, and her stripping his room of everything and taking his wallet and his car keys and the plates from his car, and doing that all in front of his friends. Can you imagine, for a teenager, just how emasculating that would be? And I think that gives us some clues into his preference for shorter women, like Jen and his 14-year-old girlfriend, and his preference for young children. It was definitely a safety thing for him. And I suspect that he possibly did spend a lot of his years as a teenager being utterly emasculated by his mother. And I know a few people have been angry with me in the comments section of the last couple of videos, but what she's described here is not okay behaviour. If your child is not tidying their room, by all means, follow whatever disciplinary actions you need to follow. But don't humiliate them in front of their friends. That is nothing but a power trip. What she did there, that was a power trip. It wasn't about parenting.
It's
Tomorrow. Everything's more convenient tomorrow.
Everything was a procrastination. Unless he wanted something, and then he was Johnny on the spot to do it.
Tell me about his friends. What were they like?
What was what?
Tell me about his friends. What were they like?
Well, so we were never very approving of them because you're the sum of the 5 people you know, and these kids were not very motivated.
They had their own family issues. A lot of them came and stayed with us when they were on the outs with their parents.
They seemed to be more interested in drugs, alcohol, partying, sleeping, and just
Sex.
And not doing anything. And I grew up differently from that. I was blessed to have a good circle of friends. Debbie the same, but how he seemed to gravitate toward these people that weren't a good influence for him, which is why we disapproved of Jen, because again, she was not a good influence for him. But
I will give them credit for having allowed Stefan's friends to stay at their place when things weren't right for them at home. But it sounds like they were extremely disapproving of all Stefan's friends. But I wonder if they make the connection there and realise that if all his friends were like that, well, that must be a reflection on the sort of individual that he was turning out to be also. Because clearly at that age, you connect with the people that you vibe with, basically. So if you are someone who is into drugs and alcohol and partying and sleeping, then they're the sort of people you gravitate towards. And it sounds from what his friends have said that that is very much a description of Sterns as well. And, well, we know the partying was definitely a thing for Sterns by the sounds of it. And I wonder if they blame his friends for him doing those things and think that he would have been the perfect little choir boy had it not been for those friends. Because then they go on and they talk about Jen. and she was a bad influence on him as well. So all these people were a bad influence on Stephan. And it's interesting that this time it's Chris saying it and not Deb. Although, that said, I think were it Deb, she would probably be saying that, putting him in a bad light. So I think what we're starting to see, the pattern here with Chris and Deb, is that Chris is blaming outside influences. Deb, in Maddie's case, is willing to blame Jen, and she wants the blame to be put on outside influences, but at the same time, she puts her son down so frequently, and she certainly conveys this idea that she thinks that he's just a pathetic piece of crap. So it's really interesting when you listen to the way they talk about Stephan. And really interesting now to hear the negativity towards Jen. They said at the start of their interview that they believed it was all on him, it was all his fault, all his doing, and yet they're circling back to Jen. Here we go with Jen was a bad influence. She's the one who got him the drugs. She's the one who got him going on drugs, even though they've just said in another sentence here that as a teenager he was hanging out with other teens who were into drugs and alcohol. So you can see where they're headed here. Never Stephan's fault.
That's what he seemed to gravitate to. And we didn't.
What do you think drew him to those types of people? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. We used to call it the wounded bird syndrome. He needed somebody he could coddle and protect. And he did that. And he treated those girls very, very well, from what I heard and saw. I wasn't with him in the bedroom. I wasn't with him when he was doing whatever he was doing. And I didn't want to be. So
I think he just felt so, his self-esteem was very low that maybe he just gravitated, didn't feel that he was worthy of somebody equal to him, greater than him. You know, you're always better off, I think, associating with people that are smarter, have more to offer than somebody certainly beneath you, because they're just going to drag you down.
Wow, so they've gone at it from two completely different angles. John was asking in relation to what had just been said about Stephan hanging out with friends who were into drugs and alcohol and partying and everything, and John wanted to know why they thought Stephan was attracted to those kinds of people. Deb straight up ignored the context of it and started trying to explain why Stephan was attracted to the sort of girls that he was attracted to. And she mentions wounded birds syndrome. He wanted to look after them. She's just described a predator. Someone who looks for the weak and vulnerable, that they can love bomb, that they can make them dependent on them. That's exactly what she has just described. So it sounds like it's not just Jen and the 14-year-old girlfriend, but it sounds like he has a long history of selecting vulnerable girls as girlfriends. And can we just recognise that she did refer to them as girls, not women? So I think that one statement from her says a lot. Now, while she's talking about Stephan being attracted to vulnerable girls and the wounded bird syndrome and him wanting to protect them, yada yada, Chris, on the other hand, goes to talking about what the question actually was specifically aimed at, And that is talking about why Stefan would hang out with druggies and alcoholics and those sort of losers. And Chris has basically just insulted every person who was ever friends with Stefan, saying that they were below Stefan, that Stefan had such low self-esteem that rather than hanging out with people that were as good as him or better than him, he had to hang out with the low scumbags of the world. So he's doing two things there. He's insulting Stefan's friends and saying they are the lowest of the low. He's also separating Stefan from that and saying Stefan's not a druggie or an alcoholic or someone into partying or sleeping all day. Interesting, because that's exactly how I would describe him. And there's been plenty of references from plenty of people that would peg him into that category. So my thoughts would be he was attracted to like-minded people. But what is the main message that's coming out of this? The main message is that none of this is Stefan's fault. He just happens to be attracted to the wrong kinds of people and hang out with the wrong kinds of people who lead him to do bad things. So it's never his fault, it's because he chose the wrong people to hang out with. And I know that a sense of etiquette would prevent Lauren and John from actually going on and analysing this interview publicly, but geez, I would love to have heard John's perspective on the things that were said here in this interview.
There was, in this most recent interview with Jennifer on our channel, she mentioned, the police officers asked her about his previous relationships, and she mentioned a possible younger girlfriend in high school. Do you know about that? She said that Stefan would have been graduating later, so he would have been like 19 or 20, and she might have been 15. I think that was said in the interview, but that's not accurate.
He graduated on time. He graduated at 17.
Okay.
I'm not sure who she's referring to. We have seen in some other conversations with YouTube about the possibility of somebody younger, maybe underage. There's a possibility, Debbie and I don't recall, we might have met her once. Again, like I said, there was always a parade of kids passing through one time. But I've seen some information out there about this person, and I think one of Stefan's friends alluded to it in a conversation on another YouTube about a younger girl. But I only assumed that it was an acquaintance and that there wasn't any type of relationship. And again, later, from what I'm seeing from the information I've seen out there, that there was never, to my understanding, there was never a relationship there, but we were made aware that this person was younger than what she appeared to be.
In the last few months, never then.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman. These allegations are false.
Did I not say yesterday Chris would have made a really good politician? Now, having a look at how all this went down. So they finally asked them about the underage girlfriend. How does Deb address it straight up? She skips talking about the underage girlfriend, but instead talks about, no, he didn't graduate later. He graduated when he was 17. So she completely skips over the girlfriend part of it. Let's draw attention to that part of the question. We don't want to talk about the girlfriend. Then Chris steps in and tries to do his little bit of spin doctoring, but it fails dismally. He's really, really vague. So he talks about there having been a YouTube conversation about a younger girl. There's a possibility that we may have met her once. So straight up, he's actually, without directly saying so, he's admitting there was a younger girl. There's a possibility we may have met her once. Not saying, well, actually, no, there was never a younger girl in the picture. So he's not turning around and saying, oh, this girl's just lying, she's a troubled kid or something. And then he starts with there was always a parade of kids in and out of the house, as in, so we wouldn't know if he had underage girls because there's always a parade of kids in and out of the house. So definitely, there's no denial here of Stefan having a relationship with a younger girl. But then he takes the Clinton approach. He basically comes out with, well, I can only assume that it was only an acquaintance and that they were never in a relationship. So they're not denying that this girl was in the picture and that Stefan was hanging out with a 14-year-old girl when he was 5 years older than her. What they are denying is that there was anything other than just a friendship. Nothing ever happened between them. It was all totally, totally innocent. Which, when you listen to the interview with that girl, I would say that that is totally incorrect. And then Deb's claiming, well, we didn't know she was that young. We only just discovered now from listening to YouTube that she was that young. And yet, we have Stefan's friends saying how young she looked. We have her saying how young she looked. The fact that she was only 4'11". So I'm not buying their denials. To me, it sounds like they are essentially admitting that they knew that he had a much, much younger girl coming and hanging out with him in their house, and they're trying to deny that there was a relationship. But come on, get real. If you're heading into someone's bedroom with them and you're a 14-year-old girl, well, there needs to be questions being asked.
But the other thing is do most parents stop their girlfriends at the door and say, excuse me, do you have ID and how old are you? The only thing I remember of her was Stephan coming in and saying, hi, this is so-and-so. I can't even remember her name. That's horrible.
That's like I said, it's just a parade of people wanting down.
We're going to go up and watch some TV. Is that okay? Yeah, sure. Would you like some snacks? Get you some Cokes, chips, whatever, go up with you. And that was it. She came back down. She wasn't adjusting her hair. She wasn't adjusting her clothes. I don't think they were up there having sex. They were just visiting.
So your teenage son takes an even younger teenage girl up to his room, supposedly to watch television, and your way of knowing that nothing happened was because when they came back down, she wasn't adjusting her clothes or her hair in front of you. Obviously, they're not going to advertise it with the guy's parents, are they? If stuff happened, they're not going to come downstairs and make it obvious that anything happened. What a ridiculous comment to make. And this whole, she sounds very defensive, and it makes me think that she is aware that things occurred. Saying that, well, when your kid has someone around, you're not going to ask them for ID to ask how old they are. That is a really, really defensive comment. And we're going back to a parade of people essentially saying, well, he had so many people through there that how we meant to keep track on it, how we meant to keep tabs. Once again, we're supposed to believe that it was a completely innocent relationship with Stephan and this 14-year-old girl, that they had no idea that she was so young, and that apparently nothing was happening with them. And, well, it's not their fault because they didn't check ID. Well, I'm sorry, but if your son's bringing home a young girl who's 4'11", looks particularly young, and heading up to his bedroom with him, no, in the interests of politeness, you might not directly ask her how old she is. But you might ask other questions, so like, oh, so are you still in school? Where do you go to school? Oh, okay, so what grade are you in? You don't have to directly ask their age. You can bet that you should be asking your son after the girl's gone how old she is, or if he knows how old she is. Pleading ignorance is not an excuse. It seems like they indulged him in terms of friendships as much as they indulged him in any other way. They didn't question who came and went from their house, and they didn't take any measures to try and convince him when he was making poor choices in terms of girlfriends or friends. And I know people might jump on me for saying that, but can we just acknowledge that you as an adult with a son who is essentially still a teenager, you are responsible for the protection of underage girls who come into your house. If you allow your son to go upstairs with a girl that could potentially be underage, well, you're making a really bad choice. There are laws which protect underage children from statutory grapes, and I'm pretty certain that under child protection laws, you allowing something like that to occur in your house could actually still be breaking various laws with relation to child protection. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Obviously, I'm not an expert on Florida laws, or in this case, no, it would have been, if he was 19 at the time, then yes, it would have been Florida. I'm no expert, but I'm pretty certain they could still be held accountable.
It was only like a 45-minute visit. So who knows?
Right.
No. And I never questioned anybody. The other girls that he was with, he was in school with at the time, so they were his age.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask that. Were most of his friends his age, or was he drawn to younger friends?
They were all his age.
As far as we know.
As far as you know.
Okay. Yeah.
So I actually cut her off, didn't I? So that what she said there about it being a 45-minute visit, trying to give the impression that, well, it was only 45 minutes. What could they possibly do in 45 minutes? Hello? And, that's not to say that there wasn't anything more going on outside of the house. She's admitted that he was going to parties with his friends. And I would imagine that, considering how devious he was, that there's a good chance that there was things happening at parties. Now, how hilarious is it? Chris is totally going to be totally would have been in the doghouse after this interview. John asked them about if his friends were his age or younger, and she said they were all his age. And Chris added in, as far as we know. I hope you caught the little bit of interplay that occurred there. She rolled her eyes at him, and he got a smirk on his face. It made me think that as much as she is probably the dominant one in the relationship, I suspect that Chris takes some satisfaction in finding ways to press her buttons. Just subtle ways of essentially undermining her or pressing her buttons, and doing it at times when she can't exactly react. Because that's what he just did there.
It's also been mentioned, and I guess this goes back to John's question about him being childlike, Pokemon cards and some toys as an adult. Was that an interest of his? Was it toys, or was it simply Pokemon, or?
No, the Pokemon died when we were in Windermere.
Oh no, Pokemon. It's obviously it's a big cult. It's a collection now.
Yeah, it is.
It had told me fairly recently that it had become a big thing. Stefan was big into that at the height of Pokemon, but he said that the cards have a higher value now, and that there's a cult out there that collects this stuff, and it lives. He's always into the latest and greatest of toys. And my God, being exposed to all the toys available at Disney, forget about it. Oh my gosh, he was
Star Wars.
What are those?
Kimagachis.
Thank you. Those things. He had a collection of those. I don't know. He unbelievable. Lightsabers. Boy, you could forget about coming to the house. You could get your head lasered off. Lightsabers all over the place. And spend all this money on that. It's like, hey, but we're not taking care of your car.
Right.
Okay, I think it's important to acknowledge here that what they're talking about there is a common trait that you see in people with ADHD. The need to collect things. You develop an interest in something and you do collect things. I will admit I have a rather sizable collection of model minis, Mini Coopers, all sorts of different Leyland minis. We call them different, they have different brand names here in Australia. But essentially, your Mini Clubmans, your Cooper S's, all those sorts of things. I've got a whole collection of model cars that are minis. I have one that I bought when I was probably in my early 20s that back then cost several £100s. I don't know what it cost in Australian money, but I do remember quite clearly because I used to buy the mini magazines from the UK as well. I think it was called Mini World. And I ordered this model from the UK, and I think it cost £225, and that's going back something about 20-something years ago. Let's not give my age away. But, it's an ADHD thing. I still, if I'm out somewhere and I see a a mini model that is different from something I've got, I'll still buy it. So it is a thing that a lot of ADHD people will do. They will collect things. And ADHD people are also known for not being great with finances, for not prioritising their spending. And that whole, it's an executive function thing. So you don't stop and think about it, you just buy it. And that sounds like what he has done. So I don't think that relates in any way to what happened with Maddie. Because you cannot say that just because someone has interests in Tamagotchis or Pokemon or something, that's going to make them a predator. I mean, my niece is 24 and she still has a whole heap of Pokemon things. She was obsessed with Pokemon when she was really little, and we still buy her things like a Pokemon thermos for Christmas, or those really tiny mini Lego things that you build things out of. She's got a few different versions of Pokemon things that she's built from that. And I can assure you she is a perfectly normal individual. She does, however, I believe, never been diagnosed, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is a touch of autism there. Definitely something that runs in our family. But, you know, that doesn't make her anything unusual. And I think we focus in too much on these obsessions of Sterns's, and it concerns me when I hear people trying to make a connection between these and his actions, because essentially what you're doing is accusing hundreds and thousands of people who have ADHD and who have interests in various things and collections of things. You're accusing them of being like Stephan.
So we're talking lightsabers as a 37-year-old, not 16.
Correct.
Well, both.
Both. Okay.
Yeah.
Never got over it.
Gotcha. Okay.
Maintaining.
But yeah, it's odd to me that a 37-year-old man would buy one of those, what is it, that the white helmets on the bad guys,
Star Wars helmet, whatever.
you know, and
the
glove, whatever the glove was that.
Well, listen, you've got these guys that are just into this stuff and they just collect the stuff, and he obviously had a fetish for it. What can I say?
John, do you have any more questions about Stephan growing up or these types of?
Do you see the
yeah.
See the disconnect? How we were just never able to just get him to assimilate into adulthood, and said, "Hey, draw the line in the sand, step over the line, and now we're an adult. Leave this behind, or just visit it every now. But the focus is being an adult."
I really do find that to be a major insult to people who are neurodivergent, as in people who have ADHD, people who have autism, because I think you're going to find there's a lot of people out there who have, I don't know if you'd say hobbies, but have collections that neurotypical people might think is immature and childish. And yet it's not a disconnect. It's not them refusing to be an adult. It's just a different way of looking at the world, and I'm not sure how to explain it. It's not about being simple-minded. I mean, so many people with autism and ADHD have extremely high IQs, and they cope quite well in the world as adults. But I don't know, maybe it's just that a little bit more of a... I've heard people with ADHD referred to as having a bit of a Peter Pan-like quality. Like they never really grow up. But that is an insult, if you ask me. It's not... Yeah, I think the only way I can put it, and hopefully someone can help me out with this in the comments, but it's not about being immature. It's not about being disconnected and being unable to join the adult world. It's just having that different dimension about you and a different way of seeing the world. And I actually find it quite offensive to be hearing this talk of, well, he collected all these figurines, he had all these toys, the Tamagotchi collections, etc., yada, yada, yada. And that makes him a lesser human being. Because, yeah, it is. It is saying that all those people out there who are neurodivergent, all the ADHD people who have collections, people like myself who have probably a collection of 50 or 60 different model cars that are minis, is that saying that I'm some sort of freak? Because last time I checked, I'm not a freak. And no, I don't play with them, but I have them in some of the more expensive ones are in their own little display boxes. Others are just on the shelf as a display. It's a collection that I enjoy and I display it. Doesn't make me a freak.
I kept waiting for that shoe to drop, and it just never got there.
The other thing that we were chastised for, apparently, was allowing him to have a firearm. That was brought up, and that was for his 25th birthday?
No, 21st birthday. He was
21 was the tattoo.
No, again, he was robbed at gunpoint at
Yes,
18. And he swore up and down that when he became legal age, he was going to be able to defend himself. So when that happened, I immediately joined him, and I hired a former Black Ops guy. We spent 40 hours, Stefan and myself, with this instructor for 40 hours doing...
Not all at one time.
Right. One-to-one training with him.
Did competitions?
Yeah, we participated in competition. He was very responsible with that. Taught me a lot because, he invested time in educating himself about firearms and what have you. But it was a method for me to bond with him because I wasn't going to hang out in the Star Wars arena. I wasn't going to get caught up in Gamagotchis. I wasn't going to be doing that with him.
Or Warhammer.
But we did go and participate and compete in gun competitions, and it was fun. It was a bonding opportunity, and that's why I got involved with it.
So they're saying here that they believe he was robbed at gunpoint when he was 18. Well, that, in terms of a timeline, would fit in around the time when his friend claims that Stephan got caught at his place basically filming his mother while she was in the bathroom, and that his father almost shot Stephan. If you go back through some of the videos I've done over the last week or so, there is an interview there's a few interviews with Stephan's friends, and I think it was in the first interview that I covered that his friend relayed that incident. And I actually said at the time, I wondered if that was the reasoning behind him wanting a gun, And now they're saying that this incident supposedly occurred when he was 18. And I can't help wondering if that's the story he told his parents, that he'd been somewhere and he was robbed at gunpoint. Or it could be that that's the story that Deb told Chris, because we know that this friend's mother apparently told Deb what happened. So I can't help thinking that actually this is the one and the same incident. But can we talk about the major issues that I have with them buying him a gun and giving him black ops training with that gun? They've claimed that he had traumatic brain injury. They've also spoken about his short temper. And Chris here has said that there was a disconnect and that Stephan couldn't really make that transition into adulthood. Now, does that sound like the description of someone that you think should be allowed to own guns? Someone who should be given 48 plus hours training so that they can be a really good shot with those guns? Now, I don't know. I'd love to know, if you get a gun in the United States, presumably you have to have a permit first to do so. And you probably have to answer various questions in that permit. Are there questions in relation to mental health or brain, like head trauma or anything? Because surely, if he really did have this TBI, then shouldn't have he legally been prevented from owning a gun? Or did they just forget about the TBI around that stage? I do find it concerning, the picture that they themselves are giving of Sterns. And then they turn around and they say that they bought him guns. And it's interesting that Deb says that the tattoo was 21, so she thinks that the gun was 25. But then if they're saying that he was robbed at gunpoint at 18, was it around that age? I don't know what the laws are in terms of what age you can own a gun in the United States. So, I mean, I would have thought 18 counted as an adult and that you could legally own a gun. In Australia, the laws vary. So, if you are in a rural area, so if you live on property, then I think you can get a restricted gun license at 14, obviously for use on the property. In terms of smaller firearms, like just your pistols and stuff, you have to be a member of a gun club, and I believe it has to be stored there. I don't know what the age requirement is there, but I do remember when I was in about year 11 or year 12, so I would have been 17 or 18, going out to a shooting range with a friend and being taught how to shoot. And she was about the same age as me and had been doing so for several years and used to compete. So definitely in Australia, in terms of age restrictions, you can get firearms when you were younger and have permits, but there's definitely a lot of regulations around it.
Yeah, Lauren, to answer your question, I did have another question. After the accident, you guys mentioned that you thought there were symptoms of PTSD. It sounds like maybe there could have been some depression too. I'm not quite sure, but
yes, completely.
Did you guys ever consider, or did you get him into counseling, or did you try to get any help for him at any point?
Well, he, as an adult, he was in counseling and
years.
for years. So I don't know. Obviously, we're not privy to what was discussed and what have you. But
no, I'm not. I'm not faulting you. I think I'm just more interested in whether you. I guess part of my question is whether you thought that his problems rose to the level of seeking help, or do you feel like they were kind of under that bar still?
I felt
as
like
a child.
I thought they were under the bar. I never thought that, oh my God, he's so bad, we need to go and get him help. Let's go put him in a hospital somewhere. No, it
was nothing like that. I mean, again, the son we knew versus the son we now know, two different people.
I really, really hope that, for starters, the prosecution has a copy of this interview, and also that they choose to depose Deb and Chris Sterns, because this would blow any argument of traumatic brain injury out of the water completely. So John asked them about if he showed signs of PTSD or depression after the accident. And they had mentioned at one point that they believed he had PTSD from being hit by that truck. But, and I mentioned this in one of the previous two videos, the timing also seems to coincide with the time that they were going through their divorce. So how can you say that any signs of PTSD or depression or changes in behaviour were not caused by that? But he's asked them, I thought this was well tackled. He asked them about if he'd had any counselling after that, and if they'd ever felt that his problems were at a level that he required any sort of help, essentially. And you can see them pausing, and I think they realised that, some things are easy to prove. So it would be one of those things you probably don't want to lie about. And I think, too, they seem to be torn between wanting to find excuses for Stefan being the way he is, but also still wanting to protect him, but at the same time they have this negative attitude towards him. They're giving mixed messages quite often through this interview. But I just find it so interesting that they're pushing this TBI argument, but now they're saying, well, he had counselling as an adult, but not as a child. We never thought we needed to get him help. It was always under the bar. In other words, there wasn't any real significant change after his TBI. Nothing that caused alarm bells, nothing that made them feel that they needed to seek help for him. That right there says everything. Wow. Have you ever come across a parent who has so much disdain for their own child? They're talking about counselling, and on one hand she's like, well, he was still doing it up to 3 months before he was incarcerated, meaning that it was probably occurring while he was working for Disney and it was being paid for by his employer, maybe. But then to turn around and say he was probably doing it for the MJ. wow. She doesn't really think that highly of him at all. She has this, I guess, I think what's going on here is, on one hand, she feels a need to defend him because it reflects back on her as a parent. But at the same time, she's then turning around and making all these really awful comments about him, which I guess in her mind also absolves her of any failings as a parent. But just wow. And you know what? It wouldn't surprise me in the least if that is what was going on there. He was going to counselling so he could have a card for MJ. I don't know how all that works because obviously it's not legalised here in Australia, so you just don't get it unless you go and buy it illegally. But wow. It goes back to what I was saying, I think, in yesterday's video. It really wouldn't surprise me if the reason Stephan wasn't actually communicating with them at that point in time when they did this interview was because of instructions from his lawyer. Because they felt that his parents weren't going to be doing him any favours.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when he did get counseling as an adult, do you know anything about that? Do you know, like, what age and how long, or did he talk about that with you guys at all?
He was still going through it up to 3 months before he was incarcerated. He was with counseling for years.
Yeah.
But it was something he sought out voluntarily, or
Yeah.
I think he did it because he wanted to get a marijuana.
Okay. So in other words, that would imply that the reason he was going was for symptoms of trauma?
We don't know. We don't know.
I think he felt like he needed it to I don't know, for anxiety, depression.
He had anxiety.
To calm him. I don't know.
Okay.
John, he didn't want to attempt to do something unless he thought he could do it well. It was hard to get him to take that first step to try something new.
Okay. So it sounds like he was also a bit of a perfectionist.
Self-perfectionist and a perfectionist with everybody else around him. You know, I think he was an emotional bully.
Can we just acknowledge here that nearly everything that Deb has said in this interview so far points towards her being something of an emotional bully? I suspect that Deb and Stephan were very, very much alike personality-wise in terms of the way that they manipulated people, in the way that they gaslighted people, and in the way that they did bully people emotionally. And I suspect maybe she resents that, possibly doesn't see that in herself, but sees it in him. And maybe that's why there is so much negativity from her, because there is that sort of resentment there and she doesn't realise that she is perhaps triggering a lot of that. It's interesting that they know that he was in counselling for many years, but they don't really know what for. And they're saying he sought it voluntarily. My question would definitely have to be, we know from interviews and from documents that Jen was on medical MJ. So did he start getting counselling after he started hanging out with Jen, when he realised that that's how he could get some of that for himself? Maybe it meant that there was more to go around. Who knows? If he was getting counselling, I have to say whoever the counsellor was wasn't doing a very good job at all. In terms of him being a perfectionist, I can imagine him being the sort of person that would chuck a tantrum if something didn't work out the way it was meant to. But definitely when it comes to someone being a perfectionist, that's also something that you see in someone who has ADHD or in someone who has ASD, autism spectrum disorder. So that doesn't necessarily correlate at all to what went down with Maddie. The only connection is that, you know, when someone is a perfectionist, you have that obsessive nature about them. And it seems quite clear that he was obsessed with Maddie.
Could you say more about that?
Well, because I think he wanted people to rise to his level when they're talking. You know, if they're talking and they're not making sense to him, he would say something about it. If people don't understand, Stefan had an IQ that bordered on genius. Seriously, I'm not saying that because I'm his mother. I'm saying he was tested. He was very high IQ, but the functionality level that he had with that IQ was not there. It didn't match unless he wanted it to. And when it matched, it was magical and it clicked. He could become almost expertise in anything once he did a deep dive into something that interested him.
Well, I would say that if he did actually test as having a IQ bordering on genius, that he completely messed his brain up with various drugs over the years. Although what she's saying there, talking about him having an IQ bordering on genius but functionality didn't match, you could easily apply that to someone on the spectrum. She has basically described what I would expect of someone on the spectrum. The ability to become an expert on something that was of an interest to him, but otherwise complete apathy. Because that's what you see quite often. I still don't think that has anything in connection with Maddie other than just the whole tendency to become obsessed with something. Clearly he became obsessed with Maddie. Honestly, it grates me to think of her saying that this guy had an IQ bordering on genius, because he was pretty much a dumbass for that entire time after what he did with Maddie. Does the way he speak reflect someone with a high IQ? To me, it doesn't. To me, it actually reflects someone with an extremely average IQ who has spent a lifetime making up stories that aren't even that credible. I would expect, if he did have such a high IQ, for him to be able to rationalize things a little bit better and create stories that are like vaguely credible. So I do question what she's saying here.
Unfortunately, nothing that he went to find a job with interested him. So
Yeah. Was that testing done, by the way, as a consequence of the TBI? Or was it let me back up a little bit. That after his his accident and the traumatic brain injury, and I guess I should say what a TBI, I guess we haven't defined TBI. Maybe some people at this point don't even know what the TBI stands for, traumatic brain injury. So in other words, it would be, in simplistic terms, it would be potential brain damage.
yes.
So could you talk a little bit more about the aftermath of that? Was he hospitalized for a period of time?
Nope.
No, they treated him, kept him for a couple of hours, did a bunch of x-rays, did an MRI,
Okay.
him home.
So there's actually quite a lot in that little bit of conversation there. First of all, John asked her if the testing was because of his brain injury. And you can tell from Deb's reaction that it certainly wasn't. She's not jumping in and saying, yes, there was an assessment done after that or anything. You can see her sitting there and you can see the wheels turning. She's trying to calculate what she should say. She's trying to figure out what the answer to that question is. And John clearly read the body language and was like, well, let me rephrase that, basically. And he wants to know more about the TBI. Now, there's something that I hadn't spotted. I've listened to this interview several times, and I actually hadn't spotted this. Now, I had spotted before where she mentioned that they sent him home after only a few hours. And to me, that says nothing serious was found. But she mentions here that they did do an MRI. Here's the thing. If you have an 8-year-old child present who's been apparently knocked down by a car and you do an MRI, if there's any sign of a brain bleed or anything like that, they're going to keep him in for observation. They're not going to send him home. So that to me says that it was definitely nothing more than a concussion. There was no sign of a brain injury, a permanent brain injury, on that MRI, or they would not have sent him home after only 2 hours.
Because
Okay.
I think they offered to keep him overnight, but I wanted him to come home. I would rather be home than in a hospital exposed to a lot of germs. And I'm kind of weird that way. I don't like hospitals, but
Again, she's basically told us there was no concern at the time. She's not saying they wanted to keep him in overnight. She's saying they offered to keep him in overnight. Now, my interpretation of that would be that she was probably making a fuss, probably making a nuisance of herself with the staff, probably being a little bit overbearing. And so, in order to pacify her, they offered to keep him overnight. But it wasn't that they wanted to, they offered to. And she said that she wanted to take him home. So in her mind, there wasn't anything serious enough to warrant him actually staying in the hospital more than just a couple of hours. To me, that combined with the MRI says that there's no TBI. There's nothing there that a defence team could argue. Unless, of course, they get that ridiculous motion granted, which we know won't, where they want to be able to essentially give mitigating circumstances to the jury without having to prove them. Because I think that's what the whole motivation with that is. They want to be able to tell the jury that Stephan has a TBI, but not have to prove to the jury that he has a TBI.
I ended up having to take him to a chiropractor to get him to walk straight again. He was walking on a cane for over a month.
Wow.
Okay.
So he walked in there on a cane. He walked out twirling it around like, Groucho Marx. So it worked. But the car had run over his pelvis and his low back when it hit both times. So he got double squatted.
Did you notice any memory loss from after the accident?
Yes, I did. He couldn't recall things easily. We would have to sit down and refresh his memory on some things that happened. He would look at pictures and he would say, where was this taken? When was this? So yes, he lost a chunk of memory.
I'm really not buying it. Now, she says that he hurt his pelvis and his lower back, and that he had to walk with a cane. Sounds like it was maybe out of alignment, or maybe she was just being overbearing or something, who knows. But this notion of him losing his memory and not knowing where photos were taken, well, she's talking about him having suffered from PTSD, for starters, and that can have an impact on memory. But at the same time, when you're a kid and you go all sorts of places with your parents, do you always remember where those places are that you've been to? Unless they've actually really pointed out to you, this is where we went, or this is where we're going. Or if it's somewhere that you go regularly, if you've gone to a holiday and you've been to 4 or 5 places, it's feasible that you might not remember where that particular photo was taken. Particularly if you have autism. I've seen this with people in my family who have autism and stuff like that, they forget. Whereas when you have ADHD, it seems to be the other way and you know everything so clearly. But I'm just not buying it. She's claiming memory loss, and maybe he did have memory loss, but if he did, I'm not convinced that it is from a TBI, because everything else she's said points away from a TBI.
And so what was the cognitive testing or the neuro testing, neuropsychological testing, was that done later to kind of assess?
That was that was because of the school system.
Oh,
They highlighted him as, they thought, potential ADHD, and we ended up going through a doctor then who evaluated him, gave him all kinds of tests and everything, and found that yes, he is ADHD, and he wasn't before. He was very focused before. I mean, the kid was laser scope focused on things. After that, he couldn't keep a conversation going.
She's not very good at remembering what she's already said. Here she's inferring that the laser sharp focus, which she's implied is something that he has up until this day, only existed up until when he had this vehicle accident. And then after that, my gosh, he couldn't even follow a conversation. Well, it sounds to me like she is picking and choosing facts and manipulating facts. Either he was laser focused only up until that accident, or he was always laser focused. But she's saying both at separate times. Him not being able to keep up with the conversation. Once again, let me point you in the direction of ASD or ADHD. When it comes to ADHD, sometimes if you are in a noisy situation, it is hard to follow a conversation because your brain is focusing on the 20 other things that are distracting it. And it feels like you're actually having hearing problems. And it's not that you're having hearing problems. It's just that your brain is processing 20 other things at the same time as it's trying to process a conversation. In terms of ASD, I can imagine him being the sort of kid that would just tune things out if they were of no interest to him. So once again, I think she is looking for symptoms that aren't necessarily connected to a TBI. Now, obviously, he would need to have medical tests to prove the existence or the lack thereof of a TBI. But it seems like what she's described on a medical level doesn't sound like a TBI at all. And she's contradicted herself. Before, when it wasn't about the TBI, he would be laser focused on things. Now, when it is about the TBI, that only existed until he had the car accident.
Or he would skip ahead. He would know what you were going to say. He could project out what you were going to say, and he would start answering what you were going to be talking about in 5 minutes before you ever got to it. And it drove his teachers bananas.
Gotcha. And so I presume that whoever did the testing knew about the brain injury.
Yes, they had all the records from the
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. That would be an interesting report to read for sure.
I wish I could find it. I can't. As we've moved
Yeah.
too many times, I don't know. It could be buried somewhere, but I can't put my hands on it. I can't. In fact, we would like to see the doctor's reports too, and I believe that because there was a lawsuit over the accident, that there is a copy of it someplace in Sarasota, in the county. So
Yeah. His defense attorney will probably want to see it at some point too, by the way.
they know
Potentially.
about it. They said they would find it.
Yeah, I think she's grasping at straws here. I just feel that there's not enough that would prove a TBI. And look, I've done a video where I've actually spoken about why I don't think a TBI defence is going to hold water. And I will try and remember to link that below this video. So if you wanted to watch it after this video, you can do so. It definitely feels like she's trying to fit things into place for this TBI argument. In terms of reports, well, I think a psychologist's report for a child who is misbehaving at school, where simply there might be a note in there saying that the parent has said that he hurt his head when he was 8, is not going to be adequate to prove a TBI in court. Because once again, it's not solid evidence of a TBI. It's just saying this child was a little turd at school and his parent claims that he had a TBI from when he was a kid. So I think she's definitely grasping here. Based on a number of the motions that we've seen, I do suspect that the defence is going to try and use the TBI excuse. But I really think, hopefully, the prosecution is a really good team and they're really switched on and they can argue against that quite well, because it sounds to me that there is not going to be enough clear evidence to prove a TBI. I may be wrong, but from everything I'm hearing, it doesn't sound like it is all that provable.
We got all copies of the he was when he had that kidney surgery in California, he was one of the first people that they used the robot on. And so they used his case in a book.
Yeah, I can beat that. My ass is in a medical journal somewhere. I had major burns. I think it was about 17%, right at the very top of my leg. And at the time, the hospital that was treating it was trialling new treatments, and I became their guinea pig. I do remember having at one point the doctor and about half a dozen medical students all in the one room. So, yeah, I can beat him on that.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
One of his, it involved one of his arteries being looped over the top of his ureter, and as he grew and his body, his trunk expanded, it was pulling that artery tight, like crimping a hose.
Yeah.
And he was at a track meet, and after the track meet, he was in so much pain that we thought he was having appendicitis and rushed him to the hospital.
The pain was similar to having kidney stones. I mean, he would be in such excruciating pain, he would throw up.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. But he was, after the surgery, he was okay? It was successful?
Yeah.
Yes, except that it kept him from the military, which is what he wanted to do to begin with. He wanted to join the Air Force. He joined ROTC in high school, loved it. But when he went to enlist, they saw the scars. They were just little puncture scars, and asked him what it was. He said, well, that's where they went in and they fixed the artery over the ureter. There's no problem with his kidney after that. But because there was a kidney involved surgery, he was deemed disqualified. Passed all of his testing with flying colors, but because of that, they didn't let him in, and that was a real blow to him.
I wonder if they got as far as the psychological testing, and if so, wouldn't you love to get a copy of that? I can't help wondering if it was more than just the issue with the kidney, because I could imagine someone like him failing the psychological testing.
It kind of upended everything he thought he wanted to do with his life.
Yeah. So, and he would have been roughly, what, like 19, 20 at that point when he applied for the Air Force?
18.
18?
18, straight out of high school.
Gotcha. Okay.
In fact, I took him to the recruitment office. Did you
notice after he was rejected for that? Did you notice any changes in his demeanor?
Very depressed, very angry.
Okay.
Which ended up being so minimal, was going to cause such a huge rift in his life.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And I presume that he couldn't revisit that after they reject him once, then it's...
No, it stays on their record forever.
Given the way she speaks about him, I could imagine that she made him feel pretty bad about not getting in as well. I wonder if there was probably a huge comparison between him and his older brother. If his older brother was successful with whatever military thing he was doing, that maybe there was pressure for Stefan to live up to the expectations that his brother had proven. And maybe he was made to feel like a disappointment after that. Once again, it sounds like she's using that as yet another excuse for why Stefan is such a failure. He wouldn't have been a failure had he not been rejected, and it had such a profound impact on him. Maybe it did, but I don't know. When you hear the stories from his friends, I think he was on a path to being a loser from day one.
Understand
I wanted to, thank you guys for sending over kind of a summary of your thoughts before this interview. That was helpful to me. There was one thing that I wanted to read here that really stood out for me. You said, I mean, there's a lot of things that stood out, but this is one that I thought was really interesting, given what we know about what happened with Madeline. I don't have page numbers here, but I'll just read it. you said Stefan has a deep empathy for people and was the person most of his friends turned to when they were in trouble.
Yes.
And you also talked about how he considered becoming maybe a drug counselor and helping people with that, right? And so,
That was that was after David's death. Yeah.
And so I think what's interesting to me, I'll have you guys talk about that in a second. I just want to reflect on that for a minute. Is that I think there's this tendency to want to pigeonhole people and say, this guy's a monster, or he's a psychopath, or whatever. But when you say that and you talk about that side of him, I think it's important to recognize this is your son, and this is a complex human being with a lot of different emotions. And even though you guys describe him as a liar and a gaslighter and all, he's all these negative things, it's also important to remember that this is someone with a lot of empathy and someone who for the most part, it sounds like he did want to do good, or he wanted to be close to people, to be close to you guys. And so I just want to point out that people can be contradictory. Things are never as simple as they seem, right? And so I thought maybe I would just throw this over to you guys to talk about those contradictions in your son and how he wasn't just one thing, he was a multitude of things.
Now, the first time I heard John ask this question, I was a little PO'd with him. I thought he was in some way coming out in Stefan's defense, talking about him having empathy towards people and him being someone who was capable of considerable empathy. But then I realised what he was doing here. See, when you have predators like Stefan, one of the things that allows them to be so successful with what they do, in terms of with grooming particularly, is because they do have this ability to show empathy. And that's not to say that people who can show empathy for people are bad people, but he has basically used that to his advantage. And it is well known that predators can be the sort of people who do have empathy for other people and can come across as a particularly caring individual. And I think that's sometimes why people are taken aback when it turns out that someone is a predator, because they think, wow, but that person has always been so nice. And the other thing that you hear quite often is their affinity with animals. And I'm not sure why that connects. I guess it connects to the empathy again. But quite often you hear about, as opposed to people who are just stone cold killers, people who are predators, because they have that capacity for empathy, they also seem to they make connections with animals and develop strong bonds with animals. And it's very, very complicated psychology, obviously. And let's be clear, just because someone has strong bonds with animals, that doesn't make them a predator. Far from it. But you do quite often see in predators where they appear to be extremely empathetic towards people, and they do have these connections with animals. So that's what John is getting at here, but without actually alerting Deb and Chris that that's what he's asking. So he's basically looking at Stefan's personality in terms of what you would expect from a predator.
Aren't we all?
Right. But could you maybe talk about, can you tell us a little bit about the empathy and the positives and the things you really loved about Stefan?
Okay. I'm a big animal person. He had such a love for animals. He was so careful with them. I mean, even when he was living with Jen, they found a kitten in the parking lot that was basically dying, and they scooped it up and took it down and brought it back. She still got the cat. When he went to help us move Chris's sister out of a place where she was and into a hospital, because she has some problems.
She's in assisted living. She has dementia.
Yeah, she has advanced dementia. But she had a dog. Well, they found that dog in the apartment in horrible conditions with a harness that was grown into his body, and Stefan couldn't leave the dog behind. He brought the dog home with him, and on the way home, he called. He said, "We've got to get him washed. We've got to get him groomed. He smells. He's got poop all over him," and and so we did. We paid for that, and he brought that dog home, and that's Sailor, and that's who Jen has now as her ESA. So he loved the animal, loved his horse Rue, really did. Loved all the horses, loved all the poodles here. He had his own poodle for a while, Shadow, but then when he left home, he couldn't take Shadow with him. And Jen didn't want a big dog because he would jump up and knock Madeline over. So when the chance came to rehome Shadow, we did. And that broke his heart because we did that. But
Skippy the squirrel.
Yes, he was always bringing animals home. He got bitten by a snake, and he came and got me. He says, he's holding his, "It bit me." I'm going, okay. Found a bucket, had a splatter stream from the frying pan. I put over the top of the bucket. We jumped in the car, ran to the emergency room, and I'm going in there. I'm saying, I don't know what happened or what it is, but my son has been bitten by a snake. Well, this is Florida. We've got quite a few. and I remember that the guy said, "Well, can you describe the snake?" I said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Here it is." And I handed him the bucket, and everybody cleared the room. I mean, people were running. So found out that it was fairly harmless.
Oh my gosh. Who does that? Why would you take a snake into a presumably crowded emergency room? Like, the guy is 37, so maybe he was young enough that she didn't have a phone to take a photo of the snake. But even still, why would you do that? What a crazy thing to do. It makes me wonder about this woman. It really does. Now, one thing I noticed when she was talking about all his pets and all his animals is that while he has this empathy for animals and makes connections with them, it doesn't seem that he forms those sort of unbreakable bonds. At the end of the day, he moved in with Jen. Jen didn't want a big dog. She says he was devastated that they got rid of his dog. But clearly, I mean, if that was me and I had to choose between my dog and a partner, I'd choose my dog. And then she talks about him rescuing that cat that Jen has and rescuing Sailor. Well, he didn't keep them for himself, did he? So he's rescued them, but not wanted to take responsibility for them. So it's an interesting difference there. And I wonder if that is a common thing that you see in these kinds of predators. They have a sympathy for animals and an empathy with animals, but maybe not that unbreakable bond that you see in so many situations. Because, I mean, I can assure you, no one would come between me and my dogs. You could forget it. So, yeah, that's an interesting side of it for sure. But in terms of John's questioning there, definitely basically related to the sort of things that you see from predators. So I'm not surprised by that questioning. It wasn't about, while it may have come across as making it sound like Stefan wasn't such an evil person after all, he's ticking boxes there. He's looking at things that you often see in predators, and he's asking questions based around those things. So I'm going to leave it at that. There is one more portion of this interview left to go, which I'll do tomorrow. It'll be interesting to see what else is brought up in that bit there. So far, it has been quite enlightening. I think we've learnt a lot. I'm no more of a fan of Deb or Chris Sterns than I was before. It seems like all this interview is about is spin, trying to absolve themselves of any responsibility, trying to create excuses for Stefan, and also trying to shut down criticism. And I know there's a few people that will be offended by my take on that, so I apologise, but that's how I see it. So, thanks for listening. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please hit the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on what's been discussed in this particular part of the interview. So thanks, and I'll catch you in the next one.
I begin to wonder